Hello, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the last video of this series, Modern Greek Poets in English, a collaboration between the Society for Modern Greek Studies and the Hellenic Centre. This presentation will take us to the island of Cyprus, and I will be speaking to you today about the work of one of the island's most successful and loved artists, Niki Marangou. I hope to engage you in appreciating the multifaceted work of this very productive artist. For Niki Marangou was not just a prose writer or a poet or a painter, she was all these things together. And within her prose writing, we can further distinguish novels, short stories, oral testimonies, and children's writing. Her work has received a number of official distinctions. In 1998, in Alexandria, she won the Cavafy Prize for Poetry. In 2004, her collected poems Divan received the Athens Academy Award. I will be reading to you today a selection of poems and prose extracts which have been translated in English by Stephanos, Stephanides, and Xenia Andreou. You can see on this slide some titles, and you are able to quickly access most of them on Marangou's personal website, from which these screenshots are taken. On this site, you will also be able to see a selection of her paintings, information on her life and activities, a blog with photos and texts that Niki Marangou published before her death, as well as a video entitled Water Surfaces, in which we can hear the writer recite poems and extracts from her work and see her wander through the streets of Nicosia and read about her beloved Famagusta with a view of the city in the background. Niki Marangou was born in Limassol in 1948 and died tragically in a car accident in 2013 on her way to a painting workshop in Fayoum in Egypt. She was the daughter of George Marangos, a surgeon who studied in Vienna and then opened his own clinic in Nicosia. Some of Niki's early memories, actually, as recounted in her stories, refer to her riding her bike in the wide corridors of this clinic. Her mother came from northern Greece and was a trained nurse, but with a love of art, which she certainly passed on to her daughter. Niki studied sociology in Berlin from 1965 to 1970, and then returned to Nicosia, where she worked for 10 years as a playwright for the State Theatre of Cyprus. Finally, from 1980 to 2007, she owned the bookshop Kochlias, which soon became a space of literary and artistic encounters and intellectual exchanges. And you can see these two photographs. You can see Niki in the bookshop, and on the right, a handwritten dedication for the photograph of the right. So owning a bookshop was a job that held a particular meaning for Niki. As she explains, the central point in my life, she says, has always been the passion with language, with the Greek language in all its forms, contemporary, ancient, Byzantine. I like to play with the language. This is why I opened a bookshop, so I could have all the books I wanted. This is why I sink in books. I go back to university, searching for words, looking for new gains. I use words like colors to illustrate images. Some come from afar. Marangou underlines in this passage not just her love of the Greek language in all its historical depth, but also the close correspondence between words and colors, and therefore between writing and painting, activities which were complementary for her. In fact, she practiced both arts in parallel. There are so many things to admire in both. In her paintings, just as in her writing, one can recognize a multicultural world, a variety of places reflecting her love of traveling, her eye for small things and insignificant details, and her love of the everyday. So you can see in those paintings, for example, the attention to the light as it filters through the slates of the shutters on the painting on the left. The human and nostalgic feel emanating from her depictions of Alexandria in Egypt in the middle, or the simplicity of the everyday food on the table, and the rich textures of the vegetation in this painting of a municipal garden in Nicosia on the top right. Her life and experiences are at the center of her work. This is not to imply, however, that her work is autobiographical. Rather, what I want to emphasize is that the artistic eye becomes the center of gravity, the point where everything converges and spreads out again within her artistic output. And what a rich output this is. For Niki Marangou's work spans geographically to include Cyprus, of course, but also the Middle East, Anatolia, northern Greece, and further north, Vienna, where her father studied, and Berlin, where, as I said, she lived and studied for 5 years. Her work spans also historically to include the experiences of the Cypriot people from the Middle Ages to the present, as they transitioned from Venetian occupation to British colonialism, independence, and the Turkish invasion of the island, which resulted in its partition. Indeed, a mental map of Marangou's world would have to be big enough to include all these areas and further east, as the following poem, one of her best known, indicates. Street map of Nicosia. Looking at the street map of Nicosia and its suburbs, Fouad Pasha Street ends on Dionysus and Heraklitou, Daphne Yüksel on Hermes Street, Yenice Shafak on Leondiou Mahera. In the vicinity of Flatro Bastion, on old maps, the river cut through the town, but Savorgnano, the Venetian, changed the flow to fill the moat with water. There, on Sundays, the domestic servants from Sri Lanka spread out their shawls and eat together. The palm trees remind them of home. Indeed, as well as mapping the streets of her city, Niki Marangou is also mapping the geographical and historical parameters of her world. It appears that the city has always existed on the fissures of history and culture. The changing names of the streets remind us of the last divided city in the world, the different names underlying the cultural differences, but also the national conflict. But they also indicate how cultures succeed each other, how they start off as something only to end as something else. Fluidity and change would be highlighted in this reading. The mention of Savorgnano, the architect and engineer who redesigned the fortifications of the city, as you can see them on the photo on the right, takes us back to the mid-16th century, during the Venetian domination of Cyprus, when the city was again cut, but from a river this time, along whose bed the Green Line was traced in the 1960s. The final lines bring us to the present and the transformation of the city's moat into public gardens. Use of space changes again, as does society, and the new circumstances bring new immigrants from Sri Lanka. But the landscape embraces change and acts as a connective element of culture. It offers the immigrants a sense of home, of belonging. The short story, Nicosiensis, further engages with the multiple layers of the past through the metaphor of stratigraphy, a term that Marangou herself uses in the story. She calls it stromatographia. Marangou is fascinated by the past, the layers of cultures under our feet and around us, and the ways in which the past can reach us through objects, old buildings, words and sounds that she discovers in her perambulations. We get a taste of this in the photographs by Arunas Baltenas that accompany the text, 3 of which you can see on this slide. Just like an archaeologist, the author uses these objects to bring to life with her stories vanished cultures and people. The title, Nicosiensis, is taken from a book of funerary inscriptions in French found on the island of Cyprus, Lacrimae Nicosiensis, and you can see the cover page on the left. This lends an elegiac and nostalgic tone to the story, not least because, as we have seen in the poem above, it is a divided city marked by tension, longing, a sense of loss, and incompleteness. But if you know Cavafy, you will understand that it is through this creative interaction of literature with death that memory may be preserved. Here is a glimpse of the city through the narrator in Nicosiensis. I often walk in the old city, the half that is left. All the streets end up on sentry posts. I walk down Lidra Street, the old central shopping street that has now become pedestrian. At the far end, you can make out the minarets of Hagia Sophia. During Ramadan, small multicolored lights hang between them. I turn right to reach the church of Faneromeni, the Hammam of Emerke in the heart of the red light district. Emerke comes from Omerie Mosque, the Mosque of Omar, an old monastery of the Augustinians that became a holy place for the Muslims when, legend has it, Caliph Omar spent a night there. The monastery had once been a holy place for the Latins too. Old chronicles speak of the imperishable body of Saint John de Montfort. John came to Cyprus in the summer of 1248 with Saint Louis to prepare a crusade to the Holy Land. They spent the winter in Cyprus, and an epidemic decimated their army. Saint Louis lost more than 250 knights. That winter, John died and was buried at the Augustinian monastery. Stories have been told of a German pilgrim returning from the Holy Land who spent a night of prayer next to the saint and then bit off a piece of his shoulder to take with her. Her ship, however, would not set sail until she confessed her deed and returned the holy relic, which grew again on the dead body. Nicosia is full of such stories, as are all old cities that carry with them layered memories. Further down, the dragoman's mansion and the old churches. The old town has a series of beautiful old churches with exquisite icons. Often the donor who paid for the painting of the icon is depicted at the bottom. Dutch merchants, Latin ladies in lace, fine-looking deceased maidens in scarlet gowns with their hands crossed on their chests, children wearing strange hats. The Holy Week services in those churches are devout, with canopies decorated with flowers by neighborhood girls following ancient customs of Adonis or Osiris. Only in those churches of the old town do I like to listen to the Easter services. Everyone is there, the man with the ancient Greek profile, the Romans, the Lusignan ladies with nets in their hair, the Saracens, the Copts, the Nestorians, Marcus Diaconus, the young woman dressed in black, the theologian in the old-fashioned suit, all dazzled among the gold and the velvet for fear of the infidels. Tradition lives here in the author and in her writing. The text is made of this rich, albeit heterogeneous synthesis of past cultures and people, just like the wall on this photograph on the right, made up of different shapes and of stone. Such a multicultural tradition defies the reduction of the city's rich and layered past to two competing ethnic groups. A potent symbol in Marangou's writing and painting is the sea. It is obviously a part of her life since she grew up in Cyprus, and this becomes clear in many short stories, and especially so the two on which I will now focus: the sea and a layer of sand. In the first one, the sea, translated by Xenia, Andreou, and Marina Marangou, a teenager Niki enjoys the sea activities in the famous beach of Famagusta near the shack of her uncle. At lunchtime, when my parents were having a siesta, we swam to the Camel, a rock jutting far out to sea in the Famagusta Bay. It had the shape of a camel until it was bombarded by the Germans in the war. The camel and the rafts were our secret meeting places, our discos of the day. The barrels under the rafts offered us a first-class hiding place. The gentle rocking of the raft, the songs from Alassia's jukebox, the unmistakable sound of the sea slapping those barrels come to me like a supplication. I can't begin to describe my happiness when I was given a canoe. I lost myself on the seas. My father scanned the horizon with his binoculars from our veranda in futile attempts to find me. I was gone. I lay back in the canoe with the oar by my side, letting the waves take me where they wanted me to go. My mask took me to another underwater world. I watched the movements of the fish, darting around or swimming more languidly, depending on the seasons. Red mullet and grouper hiding, wrasse playing, and with our metal bowl covered with a white cloth in which we made a hole, smeared with dough, we sat there fishing, and we caught them. Her paintings catch this sense of life and freedom with the vibrant colors and elegant movements of the fish, as you can see on this slide. But what I find most poignant is the meaning the sea acquires in Niki Marangou's life and work, and the way that it envelops her poetics. On this painting that I have just put here for you, you can see that it is a source of inspiration, but it is these two paintings specifically that have drawn my attention. In the one on the left, a unity in nature is suggested by the shape and color of fish and leaves, so similar to each other, carried away by the water or the wind, both creating strong currents. In the second one, on the right, Marangou writes how suddenly the garden is transformed into a sea. And this is exactly what the painting shows as we move from the left to the right. The two spaces merged into each other, bringing to mind something she describes in the poem that introduces this story. It's so different, the sea, the way it plays with you, pulls you away, stretches out beyond the eucalyptus, laden with oleanders, driftwood, and seaside memories. It's a different thing, the sea. It penetrates towns, lapping round corners, climbing on roofs, getting caught in pharmacies, reaching the court, taking with it keels and paper kites, a smell of carob, rust, kisses, and shipwrecks to set me every day to my chosen path. It is clear to me that the sea's role here is archetypal. It becomes the connective fluid of the universe, and as such, the essence of the writer too. Some of the photographs that illustrate this story underline, in my opinion, this idea. See how the title image on the left recalls images of the building blocks of cells, telomeres and mitochondria. And on the right, I have put some images to highlight this similarity. Or how indeed the close stakes of the water that you can see here at the bottom resemble cells, the foundation of life. In the poem above and elsewhere, Niki Marangou often acknowledges the instrumental role that the sea has played in her life. If the sea brings joy and freedom, however, it also reminds the author of pain and loss, especially so in relation to the Turkish invasion of Cyprus in 1974 and the ensuing partition of the island. Marangou often underlines the contrast between an Edenic past on places in the north of the island, which are described as being untouched by civilization, and the harsh realities of war, which cut through memories and feelings as they do on the map. This is clear in the last paragraph of The Sea. I had the good fortune to live in Karpas for a year before the invasion of 1974. A magical place untouched by civilization. Each person there was a fisherman, a hunter. They had their animals and their produce. The whole year was a celebration. That is where I felt the grandeur of the sea, in Afendrika and Aios Philon. Such wonderful days, such great fishing. We caught a big grouper and the restaurant owner made fish soup. Our bodies were sunburned. We had the salt of the sea on our bodies and in our hair, and that wonderful feeling of tiredness that comes from being in the sun. We seasoned our fish with rock salt. The sun dipped, and the dome of Aios Philon gleamed in its burning light. The fish was exquisite. Some officers at a table next to us talked of trouble ahead. It was the 14th of July, 1974. The simplicity of the language and the apparent lack of emotional load here makes the impact of this last sentence felt with greater strength. This is a week before the invasion. The paradise described here will be lost in a matter of days. The association of the sea with loss and trauma is even more prominent in another short story, A Layer of Sand. In this, Marangou is again recounting how, as a teenager, she would visit her uncle's house in Famagusta for Christmas or Easter. The house was on the beach, literally, as you can see on the left here. And what the young Niki admired in it was the paintings of Paul Gheorghiu, one such painting you can see on the right. And of course, her uncle's library, which reflected his love of literature. The story is very short, and I will read you the second half, translated by Yanis Goumas. And we are lucky to have a photograph of this library so that you can look at it while I'm reading. The library was oak paneled with heavy orange-colored silk curtains through which the light filtered. It contained a collection of historical books and other literary works, especially stories of travelers to the Holy Land, Lebanon, and Cyprus, some on parchments and others dating way back. I had learned to read the Roman symbols, 1687 Venice. These old manuscripts had a very distinct smell. Many of these books he would send to Athens for restoration and binding, and they would be returned with patterns on the leather cover and gold letters on the spine. One day, as I was leafing through some books, I came across one with small blue and tile-colored sketches, palm trees, fretwork, and balconies, which illustrated some rather odd poems. I had just entered high school and felt a secret satisfaction reading them. So much so that I fell into the habit of going down into the library when there was no one about and read these and only these. I took to copying the poems into a notebook. At first, I copied them down as they were. Then I started making modifications, and these modifications I regarded as original work. This is how I began writing. A few years later, Mythos made me a present of Kavafi's poem. It was the first edition issued in 1935, with sketches by Takis Kalmouchos. This was the only book that was rescued from the library when the Turkish army occupied Famagusta in 1974. We've heard nothing more since, neither about the house nor the books. The only thing we know is that the area remains uninhabited. For sure, the veranda will have run to weeds by now, and the books, if they are still there, covered with a layer of sand. 1974 cuts again here time into two. Before, the carefree enjoyment of art and life, and after, when all is covered with a layer of sand. All has entered a past that can only be recovered in art, in Marangou's writing in this case. The Greek word for sand invites further reflections. It is amos, and perhaps now you can hear what I mean. It is the first component of the Greek name of Famagusta, Amochostos, literally the city which is buried in the sand. This refers to both its famous sandy beaches, but also, in a tragic turn of fate, the way that this very sand has covered the abandoned city, creating the layer that marks the absence of life. Since October the 8th, 2020, a small part of the Famagusta area was made accessible, touching barely but not including the house of Marangou's uncle that we just saw. And this is how the book on the left was recovered from another library, covered, however, in a layer of sand. But any real nostos is beyond reach. The nostalgia for the lost homelands of the North is poignantly expressed in the following poem that I will read, entitled The Carob Tree, on Google. The poem relates the story of Nikos Nikolaou Hadjimichail and his memories of his village, Vassili. As from April 2003, Greek Cypriots are allowed to visit the occupied North, including this village. Before that, however, thanks to Google Earth, some parts of it would become painfully accessible. The room with an earthen floor was the warmest. He helped his aunt sprinkle it with water and sweep it. Every night, he would stroll around the house and the garden. He even remembered the holes from the nails on the walls. He would enter all the houses in Vassili, count the steps to Kanakaria Church, wander around the nearby villages. When he saw on Google Earth the carob tree, where he would leave the tractor as a 12-year-old boy and run first to the lentisk bush, and then to the sea, so as not to burn his feet, he wept bitterly. I would like to finish this tour of Niki Marangou's work with a beautiful poem that she herself chose to close her story Nikosiensis with. The title is Roses, and it is translated by Stephanides. It takes us into the author's garden, a metaphor also for her work, where roses from around the world are planted and tended to, happily sharing the space despite their differences. In company with the aphid and the caterpillar, I have planted roses in the garden this year instead of writing poems. The centifolia from the house in mourning at Agios Thomas. The 60-petaled rose Midas brought from Phrygia. The Banksian that came from China, cuttings from the last mouchette that survived in the old town. But especially Rosa Gallica, brought by the Crusaders, otherwise known as Damascene, with its exquisite perfume. In company with the aphid and the caterpillar, but also the spider mite, the tiger moth, the leaf miner, the rose chafer, and the hoverfly, the praying mantis that devours them all, we shall be sharing leaves, petals, sky in this incredible garden, both they and I transitory. We are all indeed transitory in this world, and everything will be eventually covered in a layer of sand. Thanks to literature, and the case of Niki Marangou is a brilliant example, the stories, the fine fragrances and essences of our passing moments may be preserved in the collective memory. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed this presentation.